President and CEO of the Fleet Science Center, and I'd like to welcome you here to our panel tonight. And if you haven't been welcome to San Diego, welcome to San Diego. And if you're from San Diego, well, welcome to San Diego. Or welcome back to the Convention Center, whatever that may be. The Fleet Science Center, as I say, I'm the President and CEO of the Fleet Science Center. Fleet Science Center is a county-wide organization. What we do is we work with communities and neighborhoods all across the county, looking at how we can leverage science, technology, engineering, and math to advance their goals and aspirations, make San Diego and the world a better place. And what better way to do that than by coming to Comic-Con? Because Comic-Con is all about community and communities, so we're really excited to see you all here tonight. I will also do, because my marketing person who isn't here tonight would kill me if I didn't, happen to say that in addition to all the work we do around the county, the Fleet Science Center also operates the Fleet Science Center in Balboa Park, the most visited museum in Balboa Park. We were happy to welcome you with hands-on demonstrations, hands-on activities, and all sorts of cool science stuff, including the world's first dome IMAX theater, which we just finally retired, the oldest living IMAX film projector in the world, IMAX projector number 2. We had to retire it, so we didn't have to give it up for a new laser projection system. I will say, though, that that laser projection system is numbered 007. So maybe not as old, but equally as cool. Anyway, if you do get a chance while you're in town, come and visit us. If you're in town, I don't know why you aren't visiting us, so you should go ahead and do that. But in any case, so welcome to this panel. We're going to talk about the science of board games and science and all sorts of good stuff with that. And we have quite a wonderful panel with us tonight, so I'm going to start introducing some folks. I'm going to try and do it sort of from my notes here so I can read them appropriately and not get any of their wonderful qualifications messed up. So right to my left is Tate Wu. He's originally from Taiwan. He's a Los Angeles-based board game designer. We won't let the LA thing and hold it against you. He's loved board game design since he was a child. His most recent release is Art Deco, 2 to 4 player economic deck building game, art collecting in museums, published by Rio Grande Games in 2021. And early this year, his game Boba Mahjong, a 2-player set collection card game, was fully funded on Kickstarter. So welcome, Tate. Then next to him, we have Matt Fantastic, is the creative director and founder of Studio Forever Stoked. He primarily does freelance game design, development, art direction for publishers around the world. They also own Elm City Games, a game shop and library, or sometimes an adjunct professor of game design, published indie games, books, zines, vinyl records, and other creative weirdness, and Killjoy and Prettiest Princess. Found the New Haven Game Makers Guild and on the board of the Game Manufacturers Association, the Tabletop Mentorship Program, the Game Development Connecticut, organized Fasticon, and the Connecticut Festival of Indie Games.
I do a lot.
It's just, it's just sad when we get these underachievers and put them on the panels. Oh, gosh. All right, next up we have Marcelo Matar. He is an assistant professor of cognitive science at UCSD, and he studies how humans remember the past and simulate the future when making complex decisions. I wonder why we have him here. Go figure. So welcome, Marcelo. Then next up we have Ishanti, I'm sorry, I'm just going to say Ashanti, and I'm not going to try because I will thoroughly butcher it. My apologies. She's an atmospheric chemist training who's been interested in board game design. She's a hobby game designer, has been involved in the scientific board games and card game design group at UCSD. Her games are focused on basic science concepts such as molecular orbital theory, food webs, and ecosystems. Molecular orbital theory, the basic kind of stuff that we all do in our spare time. So welcome. And then we have Jonathan Ying. He's a game designer based here in San Diego. Gotta love that. All right. He served as lead designer for a variety of titles from independently produced Bargain Quest to licensed games such as Star Wars Imperial Assault, Doom, the board game, and Power Rangers Heroes of the Grid. So welcome, Jonathan. And then, way down there at the end, we have... Who do we have? We have Raph. Raph Dexter is the CEO of Playable Worlds, an award-winning game designer of MMOs, such as Ultima Online and Star Wars Galaxy. He's the author of the classic book, A Theory of Fun for Game Design. His board game, Waddle Downtown, is published by WizKids. So thank you all for being here. Some questions and leave you guys up for a discussion. up to all of you. But I will say, mostly because at the beginning, my experience with board games kind of stops with the incredible engineering advancement that was the Pop-O-Matic. So that's really it. And so all these games, I know my kids have played them and tried to engage me in them, but it's far surpassed me. So if someone could explain the science of that at the end, I would appreciate it, and they would as well. But let me start with you, Marcelo. So we talked about science of board games. What's up with that? What kind of science are we talking about? And is there a science of board games to begin with?
Ooh, that starts.
Asking us to justify the panel, huh?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what is a board game? What is a game in general, really, right? I mean, it's some replica of real life, which we're all very familiar with, and we make decisions in this replica of this real life. And just like there is science of decision making and science of cognition, there is also science of board games. We need to, we can potentially understand the process by which we make decisions, we get engaged, we have fun, and I think that's what I think as the science of board games.
And so you also use board games sort of the other way around, right? You use board games to understand it.
Exactly, yeah, so that's the flip side of things, and that's also how I use that in my own research. Because there's this correspondence between a board game and some aspect of life, we can use it as an experimental paradigm to actually get a window into cognition. And so in my own lab, for example, we typically give games or often board games, in fact, and we concurrently with measuring decisions, seeing what the person actually chooses on a trial-by-trial basis in the games, we also get measurements of their brain activity, and we try to make sense of what are the processes that are giving rise to their decisions. So yeah, it's definitely true that just like a board game is an aspect of real-life decision-making, we can also use board games to understand that.
Okay. Well, so Matt, let me throw something to you, Sheila. So Marcelo was just saying that games are really just about simulating life. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think it's true, but it's a weird life, right? I mean, and I think there is an interesting distinction between games that are simulationist and games that are a little more not, more fantastical, right? Because there's definitely a whole side of board games that is explorations of history, or the CIA uses games a ton to model different things. The Department of Defense has literally game designers on staff. So there's very much this kind of real life simulation stuff. But then there's also, I want to be a duck that, knows how to bake.
Lies to his friends.
Yeah, exactly. Which duck, put poison in the cake, right? Which is definitely more absurd, but in terms of modeling real life, it still is, right? It's just a bizarro alternate dimension, right? We have this shared set of rules and expectations that we come with it, and then the closed system of the game tells us what isn't the way we think it is, right? It's rare, even with ducks poisoning cakes. Well, we assume gravity works, right? We assume that they're consuming air, and we know what ducks are, right? So even when we're adding on this sort of absurd layer, we are still existing within kind of a version of reality, at least.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I mean, and just like that makes for a more fun game when you actually can break some of the rules of real life, it also makes for more fun science, because you can actually test, push the extremes of human decision making by creating these crazy scenarios as well, and you can examine how people actually behave in those scenarios. So yeah, definitely.
And so, Ralph, this idea of so it's kind of interesting listening to both of you talk. But Ralph, like your take on this question of, again, so you've got sort of scientists looking at games as a way to study how the real world works, and games in a sense as sort of a reflection or a twisting of the way the real world works. And so when you're thinking about game design in this, you're thinking about, again, the science of what we know about people. How much does that enter into the actual development of the game?
I mean, there's a lot of psychology to board games. Like, and one of my primary tasks as a board game designer is writing a rule book, right? And the structure of a rule book in a game design, like teaching people how to play a game and how to understand a game, is intrinsically tied with how people learn anything, right? So my partner does childhood development. She studies learning in this very specific way. And it's always really fascinating to hear her explain, like, we learn so much from really awful information. Like, we get, like, you pointed at, like, a dog and you tell a baby, that's a dog. And how are they supposed to tell us, like, is it anything with 4 legs? Is it anything covered in fur? Is it that color specifically that makes it a dog? But we figure it out eventually through, like, very strange context. And how does that happen? And in answering those questions, you run a lot of experiments, right? Like, my partner does a lot of her experiments at Fleet Science Center with the kids there. And one of the things that you do when making an experiment is actually a lot like prototyping a board game, is that you have to create a set of rules for the participants, not players, to make decisions. And then you kind of see what decisions they make and follow them, you know. And that will hopefully answer your question if you've designed the experiment or, you know, the game correctly. So we talk a lot about, like, okay, how do we, for me, it's all about how do we influence their decision to make the game the most fun as possible. And for her, it's all about how do we, like, influence their decision the least so that they make the actual, like, most earnest human decision making. And even though we are aimed at kind of different objectives, we use a lot of the same tools to do those things, which I always find really fascinating. But yeah, we do a lot of arts and crafts, both in science and in board games.
So, to wrap this question again, this idea of making it fun or making it, well, it's a good question. It's a question really for any of you here, right? Those who design games. What is it actually that makes it fun? And again, for a scientist, why does that make it fun?
So, to me, the heart of fun actually comes from learning, right? It comes from learning patterns. Every game is giving you different patterns, whether they're social patterns, the dynamics of, you know, who's lying to you around the table, or whether they are mathematical patterns that you're mastering, which sometimes, you know, games lie to you about the math patterns, right? You've all played, you know, Chutes and Ladders? So, at like age 2 or 3, you were learning about wormholes and non-Euclidean geometry. Right? That's pretty advanced stuff, but we pick it up in that pattern matching way, like Jonathan was just saying, because, you know, that's how humans work. We are, you know, most of the time we're not actually conscious, if you know what I mean. We're mostly using our pattern library to operate. Like, we don't think about how we get dressed in the morning. We do it by rote, right? And it's really important for humans to learn more patterns, right? Because if you actually have to think about everything, it's overwhelming, right? So you need to build up that library. That's what so much childhood play is about, is building up a library of experiences. Games are like super handy, pre-packaged pattern experience libraries, right? That get handed to you. And that's why every species of mammal plays. It's not just us. Dolphins play, cats play, dogs play, birds play, right? It's not even just mammals. Because it's powerfully tied to learning in a whole bunch of ways. So, you know, how many of you found school not so fun? Right? Learning is not always fun. So if it's important for the species, basically, to learn this stuff, we have to have a feedback mechanism, right? And our internal feedback mechanism to get us to learn this key stuff is fun. That literally, right? It's basically, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I'm sure Marcelo can tell you much more about. Around, for example, various endorphins and pathways around dopamine triggering curiosity and getting a reward for your curiosity being satisfied, right? All of that kind of stuff. So as game designers, what we're often trying to do is lay out patterns in a way that's comprehensible to you, even though they might be very, very, very complicated. Like really, really complicated. We have to give them to you in a straightforward way. And then we have to make sure that you learn them at the right pace, because, you know, if the pacing is too fast or too slow, you'll find it either overwhelming or boring, right? And so we have to kind of thread the needle there. And That's why we run experiments on you, which is playtesting, so that we can figure out whether or not we're threading that needle.
I feel like now's the time for someone to talk about flow state.
I almost just did, but I left it for you. So take it away.
Way up.
Well, I mean, I'm the least sciencey on this panel, so I'm probably going to mangle some of the right words. But basically, this idea of flow state is where you're in the sweet spot between challenging and engaging, but not too hard, not too easy. Basically, you are, if we think of an XY graph, we're kind of in this upper quadrant here is what we aim for, right? Where we're engaged, but we're not frustrated. If it's too easy, we're just like, this is super boring. If it's too hard, it's also super boring because we just lose a bunch, right? And so we're trying to keep you in that space by creating a series of decisions, by creating a series of variables that are going to push you to try to be there, right? And that can be incredibly difficult when you're trying to design for a lot of different players, right? So we have all kinds of different people that are going to come to our games in a lot of different ways. And so not only are we trying to find that sweet spot of difficulty, we're also trying to broaden that as much as possible so that we can engage as many people as we can, right? So, Candyland, I think is actually a really brilliant game for little kids. It teaches so much. I think it's awesome. But also, it's not really interesting for me.
No game is for everyone.
Also, I agree. But, so there's these extreme ends of this place here. But, we're trying to get as close to being as broad as we want,
I think it's worth also maybe trying to operationalize more what is meant by the learning that Raf talked about, and what is this sweet spot that you're referring to, right? I think that as you're playing this game, we're building expectations, predictions about what's coming next. And learning only happens when those predictions are violated. If that violation is subtle enough that we can make sense of what caused that violation, there's learning. We make sense of it. We're like, okay, this is good. Next time, my predictions are going to be better. And that's great. Now, if everything is fully predictable, there's really not much learning going on. You get bored. You may think, well, maybe somewhere else I may have more learning that I can engage with it. And learning, as Raf said, is rewarding. So we seek those rewards elsewhere. But then the opposite side of the spectrum is, if your predictions are just violated to such an absurd degree, or maybe you couldn't even build a prediction in the first place, there's just so much complexity coming at you at a time, then there's no learning either. Like, you couldn't even make sense of what just happened. So really, I think that there's this sweet spot in predictability. And as game designers, we want to probably find that sweet spot. Like, what is the degree to which you break expectations, break predictability, but still allows people to make sense of what happens.
And also, I'm not texting, I'm legitimately taking notes.
So I just want to add, so in college, so I was a psychology major, and I have a class called, it's an operant behavior class. So everyone gets a couple mice, and put them in the Skinner box. I'm not sure if you know this experiment. So we had to train the mice how to, click and to get the color of the food, and also try to, run maze. So I think in this class, I think has a lot of influence in how I design my games, because you train the mice, and then you want to find the sweet spot. So where the mice can click, as many times as they need to get to their food. So so you'll be using color as a reinforcement reward, and just like in games, so you have points. As I use points a lot in my games, and then to drive behavior. And so if it's too easy to get, they don't feel satisfied. They feel the game is bored. So if they're not satisfied, then players will not be happy. And so using points and rewards, you drive behavior, and then so they can will take them to achieve their expected goal. Just like the mice in the Skinner box. You just have to, every mice is different too. You can, like some mice will click 10 times and be out. It's very interesting how much points, the way you're using points and reward in the game to drive behavior and achievements in game design and to get people to play the game that you're set up for them.
I have to say that I've often seen my kids looking like mice in the Skinner box, pushing different.
Well, so what's great is that we, as humans, are so used to operant conditioning in our day-to-day lives that we actually can scaffold up off of that, and it's just, oh, here's points, right? And that is sort of a subtler operant conditioning that we're giving you, right? And I work on a lot of party games. I do heavier stuff as well, but I do a lot of party games. And specifically what we do there, and I try to do this with all games, is what's the most fun thing to do? What's the most fun way to play? And then we work backwards, and that's how we give you points, right? Points are our way as designers, especially in tabletop, of shaping your play experience, of pushing you towards the most fun way, right? This is a game about trading. We want you to be interactive. We want you to be doing whatever. Great, you get the most points for being the most engaged in that trading process. And you completely get no points if you don't trade, right? So we're just making it super obvious this is the thing to do, and it's not necessarily that we think trading is the best thing, it's just we want you to do that to have the best time.
But I want to emphasize the points in exchange for engagement. And just points, I don't think are worth anything. If someone designed a game where you get points by doing random stuff, imagine you're playing a video game and you get points at completely random times. You're pressing any button and you just have no idea what's giving you the points. I bet those are going to be boring games. No one is going to enjoy it.
I mean, that's the kind of weird stuff that I'm interested in.
Idle games. Have you played those?
So
Because
now we're
then you
talking,
don't do anything.
now we're talking about like intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation in
That's
games,
right.
right? There's
Yeah,
a lot
yeah.
of different ways we can motivate games, and one of the things that people study a lot is like whether learning is motivated by discovery or it is motivated by like rewards, right? Like if you know how to bake a cake, and you know how to bake like a perfectly nice cake using these ingredients, and that's the way. If you mix up those ingredients, maybe you'll make a better cake, right? But now you are risking not making as maybe you'll make a way worse cake. And so where do we make that value judgment, and how, whether discovering a new cake, a better cake recipe is worth the risk of not getting that, or like not worth losing that consistency, is a big question both in game design and in science, and like how people learn and what motivates children to learn and motivates players to earn points, right? Like we want earning points to be the thing that is fun, like you said. You don't want earning points to be given for doing something really boring or like tedious.
Well, sort of the classic example is Risk. I assume most people know Risk, right? It turns out that to win Risk most effectively, you do nothing for the whole beginning and let everybody beat each other up, and you just slowly get cards, and you don't really engage with the system in a meaningful way. And that is sort of, I mean, I don't want to dunk on Risk specifically, but it's sort of a fatal flaw in the design, and something that subsequent designs have put a lot of effort towards encouraging people to, if this is a game about world conquest, well, conquer the world, right? Like from start to end.
So Shani, so you take kind of a different approach to a lot of this, right? That you're really looking at this question of, as you're talking about points, talking about this idea of getting to a place from this flow state, possible development, depending on the language you use, where people are living. But you're actually trying to do this to actually teach somebody something aside from the points themselves. So how do you look at, again, trying to tie this notion and still keep it fun?
I think like the point system, I think the points, as you mentioned, sometimes it can be boring if you just give the points, but like my expertise coming from designing the educational games where we are trying to teach the kids some subject matter that they feel like how to digest in the school. So we want them to have fun and then learning while playing the game. So in that case, sometimes we design the games in a way that they can do some steps on the side while they were going toward a major goal, and collecting these points in like sometimes you need to be more careful about where they're going to collect points, but sometimes it's necessary because the focus of the game is teaching some subject matter.
So when you're thinking about that stuff, right? It's thinking about your goal as a designer is to impart this knowledge, or that's one of your goals. But your goal as a game designer is for them to have fun and then sort of accidentally learn, right?
Yeah. So you need to, like, in the educational games, I think you need to find that sweet spot of balancing the fun versus getting actual knowledge. So you have to compromise from both ends a little bit to get what you really need at the end.
Because they're all gaining knowledge and fun kind of running opposite way.
Yes, exactly. They're like both ways, so you have to somehow bring them halfway through.
I'm just gonna, because this is it's one of those pet peeves of mine. So if you look at the word entertainment in 1800s dictionary, the first definition is going to be intellectual stimulation. So somehow we had, and it's a question for all of you that really is the same notion of games. We divorced this notion of learning, engagement, intellectual stimulation with fun. Fun is the monster truck rally, right? Reading a book. So again, when you think about these games, it's all the language you talk about, and all this is still this idea of engagement, right? Of how do you keep your mind actually engaged fully into the specific game? So where is this kind of question? What are you looking for in saying this? The right question here. This notion of what is fun, how do you engage? Or let's put this twist a little bit differently. So we haven't really talked about this notion of games also as a social interaction.
I mean, this is a big argument in game design all the time. Like, should the games be fun inherently, right? Like,
Definitely not.
Exactly. But a lot of designers are like, oh, we want to like find the fun in the game, make sure that it's like exciting and engaging, and like a lot of those designs end up with a very similar flavor of trying to be as like constantly pursuing that. Where occasionally you'll get games that are about tension, or games that are about fear. Like there was a wonderful RPG called Alice is Missing, which is an incredibly tense and emotional experience. And like at the end of that, that was genuinely harrowing for me to play. But I came out of it like really thoughtful and really like, that was a wonderful experience that I was deeply engaged with the whole time. But I did not laugh once during it, right? Like I felt so many emotions. But yeah, that idea of producing engagement and producing that among game design, like in game design, is a fascinating question. And like, I think I'm really curious when it comes to educational games, right? Where the objective isn't necessarily to like get them to want to play the game again when they're done. Like you kind of want them to like learn the subject, and then they don't need to play the game anymore, right? Whereas a lot of game design, it's like, okay, we want to make sure that they come back for like, this has to be a lifestyle game. They got to buy more booster packs. They got to get like those other motivations when it comes to design. You know, like just getting players invested in that specifically feels like a very different design objective than when it comes to designing for education or teaching.
That is actually one of the biggest challenges when you design educational games, because once you fully accumulated all the subject matter, you feel like that I'm done with this game, I don't want to play. So that's where we try to include this concept of randomness to games, which is really hard when it comes to science. When the subject focus is science in there. But then we try to include things like, for example, if I talk about the environment, where you can have mass extinctions happen. For example, we know that dinosaurs were extinct like that. So we try to bring these kind of things into the game, where you would have the opportunity to randomly attack someone else's system, their civilization, or you will accept your own civilization because it's a wild card that is going to affect negativity. That kind of way. So we try to incorporate this randomness into the system. So because of this, even though you know the entire subject matter that is involved in the game, you still have this factor where you don't know what's going to happen. So you can still play with the same enthusiasm. But
you have an exploration space.
Exactly. But it's really hard when it comes to the focus is science. Incorporating randomness is hard, but that's the way to get it, so you can get the people engaged all the time.
I think we get hung up on the word fun a bit, but
Says the guy who wrote.
I know. If you go look at other languages, they don't actually have the word. Fun is actually a weird word in that it developed in English out of the word fool. Okay? And if you look at other languages, especially Romance languages, the word to play is actually way more interesting. Playing is more interesting than fun in a bunch of ways. And if you look back at the history of play, it's tied into notions of chance, notions of destiny, notions of learning, and so on. Performance, and it's also tied into something I personally love, which is, you know how when you've got a machine that's like loose, what do you say that the system has? It's got a lot of play in it, right? That's actually the same thing that we talk about when we say it's flexibility. There's dynamism in the system. It wiggles in interesting ways, and that gives us lots of ways to learn about it, right? That's actually, in some ways, it's more fruitful to think that way, because when you ask people, hey, was it fun to be on that roller coaster and puke? Right? They say yes, right? Why? Why did was it fun to go hiking in the Grand Canyon and get heat stroke? Best time of my life! Right? And when you start thinking of fun as being only, we have this reductionist notion that it mostly means sort of a joy, but fun is often not joyful at all, right? And we often apply it retrospectively when we say, I went through something consequential, harrowing, learning, challenging. We say it was fun, and that's why I tie it really back to learning. And I think, the place where it gets super concrete for whether it's games about science or candy, right? We are always learning when we're playing a game, and we do give up on games when we decide that we figured it all out. Sometimes when we're wrong, but we underestimate, I think, sometimes how much there is inside a system. Tic-Tac-Toe is one of my favorites. Any of you still play that for fun? One or two of you? Tic-Tac-Toe has, there's something like a couple 100,000 possible games of Tic-Tac-Toe, right? It's not small. When you open up that box and look at the gears, it's big. But as games go, it's tiny, right? We figure out, it's actually symmetrical in all these ways, and it's mirror reflected, and actually it turns out there's only a couple hundred games, right? That's the stuff you're learning. That's the pattern you're mastering and figuring out. So every game is teaching us patterns, and the challenge of a game designer is, which ones am I teaching? Because the players will pursue the one they get rewarded for, right? And so something like every game involving chance, which all of us are bad at. I apologize to anybody here who thinks they have a system for the ponies. Wrong. Right? Humans actually just can't do it. We are bad at odds, period. But game designers use that because chance has this thing where it still triggers the, I learned something mechanism. It triggers the reward. And we're actually kidding ourselves, right? So we use that to get you past some of the rough spots, right? We help you along in your learning that way.
I think something with that too that's really exciting is when you hit those outliers, right? I think that's what's most exciting about chance in game is that moment where somebody rolls a 20 in the most clutch situation, right? And I only will hit on a 20, and oh my God, right? Or I'm going to blow up all your guys or whatever, and then you roll 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, right? Those, I think chance is really exciting because we have that pattern expectation, and we're like, okay, this is cool, this is interesting. But when it really shines is when we sort of break the frame on that, right? And when chance behaves in ways that we weren't expecting, in ways that are totally breaking the pattern. If you've ever lost in Catan, it's because the curve was totally off and you got completely screwed, and no wood got rolled. This is garbage. How did this happen, right? Or vice versa, right? Oh man, I did really well in this tough situation where the expectation from my pattern of experience of playing this game is subverted, is different than what I was expecting, right? I think that's a great place for us to create that ongoing interest because that pattern is always going to be dynamic. You can't solve it if there's a bunch of dice, right?
Speaking of like solving games, and there's like a whole, a lot of game players, right, particularly competitive players, their objective is to break the game, right? They really want to find the nuance, and so when it comes to designing games and playing board games, here's a completely different discipline of science, which is scripting and like coding. I think Tim Fowers once said that board game design is running code that runs on people. I'm designing I'm designing a program that runs on people. And I think it's really true. You're kind of like creating a set of rules that they are told to follow, and they will follow those rules, but they will also like follow those rules to the point where either the game breaks if you've written the rules wrong, or the game breaks if you've written them imprecisely. And they're like, oh wait, what is this? Oh wait, you're using this loophole because they didn't say like in 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons, dead is not a listed condition that a player can have, which means that while you are dying, you can't move, you're unconscious or whatever, unconscious or dying, you can't take actions, like all that is listed. But it doesn't say what happens when you're dead, meaning once you're dead, you can continue to take actions, you can get up, you can do all these things, because they didn't cover that, right? And so like that sort of like head slap moment.
I prefer to think of that's not cheating, it's not exploiting, it's volunteer co-designing. They're fixing up your mistake, you know?
Yeah.
It's just a different way to play.
Well, that's also really fun for some people.
It is, yeah, that is fun.
I personally prefer 5th edition, I think it's pretty good, but I loved 3.5 because it was so expansive and so breakable, right? There were a ton of really interesting things you could try to pull off when you're grabbing this feat from this book and doing that, whatever, and I adored that, right? But which is a completely different play experience than what they were designing for, right? They were not designing for a bunch of us on the internet to make it so that we win, right? But that kind of emergent play is something that's really exciting for us as designers, right? Is when people are finding things that are entertaining, that are interesting, that are engaging, that we completely had no idea, right?
The discovery piece is just so important, right? Like that, if the game again becomes too predictable, it gets boring. The Tic-Tac-Toe is a great example. Almost no one raised their hands. It seems like people are not very much into Tic-Tac-Toe. But actually, in my own research, we actually have been playing with Tic-Tac-Toe. We actually expanded the board a little bit, only from a 3x3 to 4x9. And instead of doing 3 in a row, you do 4. People love that. It's a whole lot more complicated. There's a lot of strategy. It's actually, for us experimenters, it is the actual sweet spot because the game is simple enough that we can understand and study their strategies. And it's not so complex like chess or Go, for example, which is, that's so it's complicated.
I mean, on the subject of gamifying information retention almost in this type of learning game, I designed a game called Game of Thrones, the trivia game. And I found trivia games are one of the most annoying things to design for people because either someone knows all of the answers and the game is literally trivial, it doesn't matter, or they know nothing and it's like, what? And so you have to do this weird amount of creating questions that are obscure enough that even someone who's fairly familiar with the property can maybe get them if they know the context. You can't say oh, how many men did they bring this battle? 405, 406, or 407, that's terrible. But if it's 10, 45, or 1,000, right, you have some context, you can kind of remember that sort of thing. And so feeding into what players know and learn and being able to create a game around that type of knowledge. And I realized that the game stopped being about what do you remember about Game of Thrones and started more being about what was the story, being able to maintain that your broader understandings rather than remembering very minute details, because minute details are the least interesting thing for a player to enjoy thinking about.
They're not systems,
right?
They're not systems. They're not patterns you can learn. The problem with trivia, I also worked on trivia If you've ever played at like, the buzz time trivia at a Buffalo Wild Wings or something. Yeah, so if you play that on a tablet, that was actually my trivia game. You can't get
real
better.
bad.
Yeah, you can't get better at trivia by playing trivia, right? There's no system to it.
I'd like to disagree.
You know, you get better at it by,
You play
by
enough.
playing the other stuff or by learning facts.
Well,
you know what I mean?
so I think there are different approaches to trivia, because I also work on trivia. We actually have one coming out called Everyone Else Thinks This Game is Awesome. It actually is based upon scientific principles of people following others, and the game is less about the trivia. The trivia is there, the trivia is the vehicle, but it's about knowing who you think knows the answer and following the crowd.
Yeah,
whatever.
exactly.
But just purely in terms of writing trivia, I think similar to crosswords, I think is something people are more comfortable with. Certainly crosswords is a game of knowing words and definitions and things, right? But if you do a lot of crosswords and crosswords that are well constructed, there start to be sort of standards, things that you see, patterns of the way, this is title case within the clue. So okay, so I get this now, right? Or this is an abbreviation, right? So you start to learn some of the patterns that exist within that system. And I think it is similar in trivia, right? I think really, really well-written trivia is murderously difficult, but it is trivia that if you have knowledge, you can make a reasonable guess towards if you know other things, right? So instead of the how many people were there, right? That's just a know it, don't know it, right? But you can construct questions in a way that I might be able to use my other knowledge, my general knowledge, my knowledge about this, that, or the other thing, and make a guess because the trivia is written in such a way that it's giving me some of these building blocks. If you're interested in trivia, highly, highly recommend checking out Learnedly. It is super cool, and you can just go and look at previous questions, and you can see some of those questions are constructed in this really great way, and you start to understand the conventions of that sort of approach, which allows you to make better guesses, even though you may not know, the binary, do I know it, do I not know it?
So we'll come closer to the end here. So if anyone has any particular questions, there's a mic in the middle here. Feel free to step on up. So there's about the sign that says 10 minutes. You got 10 minutes to think your question. And while you're thinking of them, I've got a question for all of you, from me. So we talked about this in the study, and you kind of hinted at some ideas around this, but I'd love to know from the game design side and from the science side. Something that I certainly have experienced is that you'll play a game, and you'll love the game, and then one day, suddenly you're done. Completely done. And the notion of picking that game up is, cover your ears, designers. Yeah, my kids say, boy, we should play that game. We all look at each other and go, oh God, no. Sometimes we love it to death. So what changes? What is it about, well, from a design perspective, what's the notion, there's some things that come here, and from a science perspective, what does that change where suddenly this thing that was so engaging at some point isn't anymore?
I think it's like Raph was saying about the expectations, right? We need to know, we need to be close enough to kind of get why we're wrong, but also challenged to get it right. It's that flow state.
Pursuit of novelty is a whole thing.
Yeah, I'll
That's
throw
it.
out a scientific word, heuristic. You all know that one? Heuristic boils down to a good enough solution. Okay? So have you ever been in a playground game and you needed to build two teams? So let me guess, you probably all solved it the same way, which was, well, who's the best kid? Who's the second best kid? They're the captains. Now they get to take turns picking, right? That is not actually the mathematically best solution to solve that problem. But it's what's called a greedy algorithm, and it is a good enough one. And so you settle for it, okay? Because all of the better solutions are hard, so you still do them. That is the answer to your question, Steve, because when people get to the point where like, well, I know how to beat this game, I mean, I don't necessarily do it in the best way, but I reliably win against my circle of friends, I got a good enough. And that goes in our pattern library, right? If we want to keep it fresh, there has to be something that makes that previous pattern get upset, as Matt said earlier, right? There's got to be something that triggers that next level, as Marcelo said. We're all agreeing on all of this, right?
I think a lot of it too.
Yeah, so we should throw.
That answer was good enough.
Yeah, good enough.
Hi, do any of the game designers incorporate the science of game theory into your games?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wizards of Lemon, you study it?
I mean, I'm certainly no John Nash, but definitely, I think that kind of, Prisoner's Dilemma style stuff. There's certainly games that don't, Pictionary, you don't really necessarily need to worry about that stuff, but anything where there's a kind of a meta game. Yeah.
If anything, game theory applies to us, like, as designers. Like, we don't even, I know game designers who are excellent who don't think about it at all on purpose. But when, like, a game theory person talks to them, they're like, oh, yeah, it's just like this. This is all game theory. No, I guess it is.
It's risky to use it too purely because game theory does like to, it's very mathematical. It likes to assume optimal decisions and all of that, and people ain't optimal. You have varying skill levels, all of that kind of thing. So I always like to say game theory is helpful, but it will not necessarily make your game better. You really need to be looking at the psychology of the players.
Well, something I see a lot with students, with up-and-coming designers is, I did all the math, it's so balanced, it's so all this, and I'm like, well, that's why it's really boring and uninteresting. Because, the imbalance, the discovery of that is really interesting, right? And that's where, knowing some game theory is really helpful because you can set it up in such a way that those choices are not necessarily obviously optimized, right? And so there's that player exploration of trying to understand what are those optimal choices, and then they can kind of grow through the game. But then, you hit that. Good enough.
Honestly, any game where there's one optimal choice at a given moment is probably broken.
Hi, so my question is, how do you keep games engaging and fun when, psychology-wise, when apps like TikTok and Instagram exist that continuously distract players and give you that instant gratification that games don't always provide?
I'm too old to know anything.
I mean, it's tough. Like, a lot of the time we kind of rely on the idea that, particularly with like a board game, people come to the game on purpose. Like, you're there with friends and in person, which I think is a big advantage that like table games have over things like app games, where it's like they have to compete with the app store, whereas like tabletop games, like, okay, we are in a room looking at people, looking them in the eye, and that like is inherently adds an element that.
I think this is a moment to toss it to Marcelo, who can tell us about peak cognitive moments and cognitive troughs and why it is that there needs to be a certain interval of feedback, because that's what TikTok is doing.
5 minutes.
And the pace of TikTok is one part of what makes it distracting, right? And in games, we actually do pay a lot of attention to how quickly are we giving feedback, right, to the player. This is why we avoid analysis paralysis games, right? We try to design against that because that is an opportunity. One person who's analyzing might be into it, but everybody else is, right? And so, thinking about the pacing is super important for what you're talking about. That's what TikTok is,
Yeah, so the field of research that is relates to me is that there's always an optimal timing or rate with which you're presented with information, because after any information is presented, you need to process and assimilate that information. That process of assimilation takes time too. So if you're just presenting information non-stop, and you don't stop and think and process what you acquired, you'll get tired. That's actually what cognitive fatigue is. Cognitive fatigue is not physical fatigue. If you eat ice cream after you're cognitive fatigue, you're not going to get better. You need to process what just happened. So there's definitely this optimal pace. The same way there is boredom that happens if that pace is just too slow. So I think that's related to what.
Minutes left. Let's go.
First, I would just like to start with a comment on that. With neurodivergency, analysis paralysis can be like 5 times more likely, maybe even every decision, because obsessive compulsive optimization. But on my question, This is kind of broad, but like, what do you all think you could have to say about how some games that have maybe not changed at all have such strong communities because it's competitive and all the difference is coming from the players changing their own meta within itself because humans are human.
I mean, metagames are, I'm in the fighting game community, so like, I know a lot about like,
Like
people still
all
play
the
Super
old
Smash Bros.
Smash games and crap still are.
Yeah, I think that question may be a little too big to answer in the next 3 minutes.
I actually think your answer is in your question, right? It's basically the games that last for centuries, right? They either have to be deep enough that we can't find a heuristic, right? Chess, Go, whatever, poker probably, right? We can't actually wrap it all in our heads. Computers maybe, but, games with other people. People are unpredictable and with endless amounts to learn. So basically, it's self-refreshing games. They keep designing themselves.
I'm not just playing the game, I'm playing you.
Exactly, right? So yeah, you answered your own question. It is because of the people in it.
Cool. Do it.
Sorry, real quick, there's also a huge difference between perfect information and closed information, and is there the opportunity for meta, right? So chess is as successful, Go is successful because it's just so complicated, but it is perfect information, whereas something like a Risk, you have no idea what's going to happen, and that's where that kind of like meta game development, like when Risk came out, everybody immediately wasn't like, oh, just turtle up in Australia, right? Like it took a while for that to develop.
Two types of uncertainty always. One is reducible, the other one is irreducible. One is called risk, the other one is called aleatoric uncertainty. So in one of them, for example, in Go and in chess, you have a perfect model, knowledge of how the game works. So it's perfect knowledge in that sense, but you still have irreducible uncertainty by the opponent. That's just, it's never gonna reduce, right? So that's actually two terms and two types of uncertainty that are fairly commonly used in science as well.
Hi, with respect to multiplayer cooperative games, do you guys have any experience with using science in order to prevent them from basically becoming a single player game with the one who's the best at the game controlling everything?
Of household quarterbacking.
I think imperfect information and chance is kind of
Those are the main tools that we use, like making it so that one player literally can't make all the decisions. Some of these games, they just can't even talk.
All right, next question.
So artificial intelligence, machine learning, and deep learning are disrupting a whole ton of fields. How are each of you dealing with this in game design?
I make a bunch of really weird stuff that robots are like, way too smart to
Robots are going to be really bad at improv games for a while, thankfully, but
Some of the stuff that I've done in terms of trying to formalize game design actually is getting used by professors to create game designing AI. I was simultaneously flattered, deeply flattered. Wow, my work turned into this. And also simultaneously horrified, like I just theoried myself out of a job. So I guess the answer is mixed feelings. I do believe we've got
we just got to get the AI to buy the games.
Yeah, we've got a long way to go on AI, and I do believe, to our credit, that we'll know that we've succeeded at making an AI when it starts having fun playing games, because then we'll know we're on even footing.
All right. Well, thank you all. Please thank the panel.
And I don't work at the Fleet Science Center, but I love going there as a kid, and you should totally go. And I don't